Chapter 4 reviews the most significant theories that you'll utilize. Your textbook on Chapter 4 goes over psychoanalysis with Freud, Adlerian, behavioral, cognitive, humanistic, existential, narrative, feminist, and family therapies. Psychoanalysis starts with Sigmund Freud, who was the first person to really sit down and do talk therapy. He had this idea that by talking out things, we could bring our unconscious thoughts of what is provoking us to react certain ways to the forefront and recognize the meaning behind our actions. He also did a lot of research about how we are driven by our basic human needs, and the decision that we make about our impulses and just getting our needs met is controlled by the id, ego, and superego. And if you think about the id, ego, and the superego, you almost would think about something as if it was like the devil and the angel on your shoulders. On page 74, if you're following along in your book, it talks about the id is the infant. The id is that infant that is crying. It's like, I want it now. It's basic driven impulse. It's that urge that you feel sometimes when you're wanting to do something, but something holds you back from doing that. When we're younger, we have so much less control over those urges. The ego, however, it's a personality structure that we develop. It's kind of like the part of us that kind of goes back and forth. Like if you're sitting at a red light at 2 a.m. in the morning, you've got the id like, run it. And then you've got the super ego over here saying, that is against the law. You will go to jail. That is not okay. Giving you all of the things that is morally correct. And then you've got the ego that kind of sits and takes both sides of the information and makes a decision from it based on what is socially accepted the majority of the time. What is realistic in this situation. The super ego, it really is, it plays defense. It plays defense against the id. It kind of blocks those urges. And so, according to Freud, one of the things that we do is we have these urges, we have these desires, these basic human needs to do something, and our super ego tells us all of the consequences and why it's not okay, and then our ego kind of takes both sides into account of benefits and consequences, what's realistic, and makes that decision for us. Obviously, some people's ego works better than others. And then he goes on to talk about anxiety, reality anxiety, and neurotic anxiety. So basically that is exactly like it sounds. Like there is anxiousness that is supposed to be there. It's supposed to be part of us, part of our makeup. It allows us to have motivation. But when it gets to a level of neurosis, it impairs us. It's no longer beneficial in any sense. So if you go back to the id, the ego, and the superego, the ego is the part of the personality that is supposed to control those anxieties. Like, you might have an urge to blow off a test, and then the superego is like, we don't want to blow off the test, we don't want to fail. Well, the ego is the one that regulates all that and says, we're going to study, it's going to motivate us to study, let's put some time in it, it's important, and all of that. But when things get to a neurosis, think about how the ego can cause us to do repetitious things, compulsive things in that neurotic reality to try to reduce the stress that we're under. The ego, and the way that the ego works, the ego also has these defense mechanisms that we behave and react in a certain way to try to deal with these neurotic things that we have. On page 75, they give you 9 different defense mechanisms to review. repression, regression, projection, displacement, rationalization, reaction formation, denial, and sublimation. And so I want to go over these just real briefly. Repression, you just repress it. You're not gonna deal with it. You're basically putting it so far into the unconscious that you're not even gonna act as if it's ever happened, that it's no longer part of your allowed memory. Regression is when we return to a previous behavior that we once had. There's a lot of times you'll see children of sexual traumas will regress back to earlier phases of not potty training, bedwetting, those kind of things, even after they've been fully potty trained. Projection, that is when whatever is going on with us, we project it on someone else. So if we're mad at someone for, like, we might call them out for saying that they don't do this or they don't do that. Projection is saying that we're really mad because we don't do this or we don't do that. Displacement, that is where you have an emotion. You've probably heard of this saying, like, you can't talk to your boss, and so you don't know what to do with that anger, so you go home and kick your dog. And that's what displacement is. Rationalization. Rationalization is where you try to rationalize why your behavior is okay. So instead of saying what the facts and the reality are, you rationalize why what you're doing is okay. So if you were truly not qualified for a position, you might rationalize that it was because of the person that interviewed you just didn't like you. Reaction formation. This is where you have an impulse or a desire to do something, and because you're so fearful of that impulse, you go completely the other way. So that would be something like the textbook provides you an example of going through and being afraid of not being able to handle the school load, and instead of focusing on doing the school load, you actually sign up for extra classes and overload yourself. So it's the opposite behavior, so that it truly hides the fear that you have. Another good example would be something like someone addicted to porn might lead a crusade or protest against a porn company or business in the local area. Denial. Ain't true, didn't happen, right? Refusal to believe, accept, or face any unpleasant reality. So there's 10,000 examples of denial, but something that's probably very similar that I can think of. Like, I remember when I realized that my brother was using drugs, and I said something to my dad about his eye. My dad just kept saying, like, no, he just has allergies. And I was like, yeah, but allergies has nothing to do with him eating a whole bag of Doritos, so he was totally in denial. And then the last one is sublimation. Sublimation is where you take some type of sexual aggressive energy, and you take it and channel that energy somewhere else. So like you could have this energy to do one type of thing, and then so maybe you funnel it into being the best tennis player or exercising, working out, or even some type of study and research. You just bury yourself into something else and take the energy and put it somewhere else. The goals of psychoanalysis is transference, free association, interpretation. So the ways that those are done in the goals part is free association is where you've heard of like Freudian slips, like where words that you say have very much meaning to them, and you don't want to have a lot of time to think. You want to kind of have that quick pace where you do like a Rorschach test or just a very quick response, like first thing that comes to mind type of free association. Transference. Psychoanalysis uses transference a whole lot in the ability to use the therapist as a tool, where clients can transfer what's going on or the person that they have a struggle with in the session. And then interpreting what that person was not recognizing that was going on in their unconscious and bringing it into the conscious. so that we can truly understand our actions from a much more meaningful place. A lot of people have issues with Freud. I don't know of any current philosophers that fully agree with everything that he says, but I think that he still deserves the recognition for some of the ideas of how things manifest in our unconscious and how we sometimes behave in ways that we don't really know why we're like that without exploring those reasons. And so I think that's a valid point. And then the last thing is object relations. And this is where, like, for an example, you would see like people talk about, say, women marry men that are like their fathers, and it's where you take an early relationship and then you present that into the current relationships from your past, and that they resemble your earlier relationships. So that would tie into where you see maybe someone that was abused in their youth actually go into an abusive relationship in their adulthood. Theorist is Adler, Adlerian theory. Adler did work with Freud for a little while. He did not agree with all of the Freudian tenets of that theory. His basic assumptions were that everything that we do is purposeful and that we don't do anything for no reason. And one of the most important things as a therapist is that we need to understand the behavior from the client's perspective of why they did what they did from their reality. That a lot of our actions are based on what that person views as social norms and what's socially acceptable. And that often some of our actions are based on superiority, striving to be superior over someone else, to not be inferior. And so throughout our life, we develop this cognitive map that allows us to strive toward these goals that we have set, whether we realize them or not, in some way of filling whatever social interest, social status that we have set as our goal. If someone feels that they didn't get they lack the support, they have some kind of irrational goal that is just can't be met, they have mistaken lifestyle beliefs, these are the things that can cause what we would consider mental health symptoms. Ways of treatment is establish collaborative relationships, really work on those mistaken belief systems, and try to identify what the distortion is and correct it. Some of the ways that your textbook processes some of the techniques that Adler had is on page 79. And those are acting as if. And that is where you tell someone, like, if they are scared or fearful, act as if they're not. Kind of that fake it till you make it mentality. The other one is spitting in the client's soup. That's where you take something that is, this is one of those techniques that's always been really hard for me to do. So it would be something like reframing a situation to where, like, if that's a negative consequence, but the client sees it as a positive consequence, that you reframe it in a way to where that's doesn't look nearly as good as they had pictured it in the first place. Paradoxical intention, increasing the client's awareness of their ineffective behavior by prescribing an increase in the display of the symptom. So basically what that means, one of the best examples that I can give you is like an example of someone that has insomnia. So that person cannot sleep. So every night they go to bed and they try to sleep. And so paradoxical intent would be saying, don't try to sleep, stay awake. Focus on staying awake. Don't focus on falling asleep. Kind of doing a reverse technique on that. That I always like that one, because I think a lot of times when people have had severe mental health symptoms for a while, they don't ever think about what it would be like to not have that. So asking how their life would be different if they didn't have that symptom, if they didn't have a mental health issue, how would that look? I think that's always a really good and catching oneself. And that's really where you're just basically asking someone to kind of check in, be very conscious. It's like, try not to say a cuss word, right? You catch yourself. And the more that you catch yourself, the better that you get at not doing it. Okay, that takes us to behavioral therapy, which is Pavlov and Skinner. And this is really where you are looking at the whole learned behavior. You probably have heard like where Pavlov rings the bell every time he feeds the dog, and then it got to where he could ring the bell and the dog would salivate. And so operant condition with Skinner follows that same line, that you can reinforce the behavior by either adding something or removing something, enforcing a behavior or punishing a behavior to to decrease the behavior. When you are looking at behavioral therapy as a treatment, then your goal is to unlearn some type of behavior that is not benefiting you. So to take that behavior and change it in a way that benefits you more. Some of the ways that you can do that is systematic desensitization, so let's take something that everybody like has maybe seen or at least more familiar with, like being scared of spiders. And so systematic desensitization would be where the first thing you would do is just imagine a spider and work on controlling the anxiety just by the idea of a spider. Then it might go to a cartoon spider, like a drawing that was less threatening, and you would just take these very small baby steps. So like people that I've worked with social anxieties, like it might be just driving to Walmart and sitting in the car and dealing with that anxiety. And it might take 4 or 5 different steps just to even get them out of the car to the door. So it's that small little increments to where you can recognize that anxiety, deal with it, and get it under control without it having to flood you all at once. Assertiveness training, it sounds exactly what it is. Being more assertive. Contingency management. This is used a lot with children behaviors like token economy, where you get a reward, maybe earn something, allowed to do something, allowed to play something. I know when I quit smoking, I would say I'm going to take that money that I would have spent on cigarettes, take that money and use it for like new clothes or a vacation or something I wanted for myself. So that's some kind of contingency management. One of the most well-known techniques for behavioral therapy is the ABCD, and that is the A, activating event, B, belief, C, consequences, and D, dispute. So the ideal in behavioral therapy is that there is an activating event. It could be anything. Pop quiz. And so as soon as this activating event happens, then there is a belief that we have. In a split second, we have this belief about that activating event. So if we go on the neurosis side, we have A, activating event, pop quiz, B, belief, I'm going to fail, C, consequences, extreme anxiety. So if you take that same idea and use the ABCD technique, then when you recognize that belief is I'm going to fail, C, the consequences, the D would be disputing it. What are the facts? How often have I actually failed? When I study, do I fail? So you have to kind of do this almost like internal argument with yourself that says, is this true? Is this real? Or is this just my mind getting away with me due to anxiety? And that's the ABCD model. I've always used that quite a bit. There's a lot of workbooks out there where you can have clients write down like what happened, what they thought about it, how that affected them. So the idea is for you to change the D to recreate, to reframe, and begin that to change that person's B by them monitoring that and changing it. I mean, if you take 2 events, like being in the grocery store and seeing somebody you know, and then being very brief with you. So there's your activating event. You can have a belief system that says, gosh, they're in a hurry. I just need to let them go. And then you can think about like what kind of consequences, how does that affect you? What kind of emotions do you have after that reaction? Or you can have a reaction that says like that they were rude, you must have done something wrong, they don't like you anymore. And then you have reactions to that, your C, which is your consequences. And so you're really working on that person's belief system. Your next section is cognitive approaches. Your key theorists are Ellis and Beck. Ellis did the rational emotive behavioral therapy, and Beck was cognitive therapy. Ellis believed that the irrational inner dialogue is what is related to our emotional pain, so that you can see that that's close to the behavioral therapy part of that. So it's all based upon that emotional regulating of our internal thoughts. And so Ellis believed that how we do our self-talk, our internal self-talk, was the direct result of how we felt emotionally. So the difference between Ellis and Beck is that Beck believed that our automatic thoughts stemmed from cognitive distortions. So it's kind of very much similar, but one focuses more on the emotional part and one focuses more on the thought part. However, it still goes back, both of them still go back to that self-schema, how we were created, all the events, all the life things that happened within us that make us who we are now. Because that's how we infer how the world looks. That's how we make generalizations on how people are. So if things happen to you in your upbringing that made you very much feel that people are not trustworthy, then it makes sense to say that you don't trust people as an adult. So, it ties back into that self-schema. And so those distortions are very much part of our internal dialogue, our self-talk. And some of the things that you would not even really process without really thinking about it are cognitive distortions. So like, for example, to say that people are to just work hard and do what they're supposed to do is a cognitive distortion. Like, that's my belief system, but everybody doesn't hold that belief system. That you should respect your elders. That's a cognitive distortion. That's my belief system. And so we really don't recognize how much of our thoughts and our processes and our things that we think are norms are actually not norms. They're our belief systems. Everyone doesn't hold those belief systems. But because you were probably primarily around, culturally ingrained with people that had very similar belief systems, it looked as if that was a norm for everyone, and it's not. So that's something really in these therapy sessions when you talk about cognitive distortions that is really easy to pick apart and sometimes very hard to pick apart. So identifying activating events, irrational beliefs, emotional consequences continues from behavioral therapy. And then you have to dispute that with the D, guided discovery, asking those Socratic questions, exploring how people think about things, talk to themselves, what's going on inside their head. Narrative repair is another really good goal that happens in cognitive therapy, and that's where you rewrite the story with a little bit of a spin on it after being able to process it out in the reality. I'm sure everybody maybe be able to have like at least one time where they reacted a certain way, but when they look back on it and got more information or looked at it from other people's perspectives, maybe that it wasn't the way that they perceived it to start with. And so that's a way to like do that whole narrative repair. The next one is humanistic existential. This is one of the theories that doesn't go a whole lot back into your history past as much. It's very Rogerian. It's Carl Rogers. He had some basic principles, and they were be there for that person, don't judge them, be in the here and the now, the moment with them. People have a strong need to be accepted and loved, and if you provide that person with the ability to know that they can get all that stuff out and that you're still there with them, then they'll figure out their own way and they'll figure out the answers that they need. You just have to create that environment that lets them know that you're there with them and that you will not judge them. So obviously that's where person-centered come from. One of the things, the biggest techniques that Rogers has, because he doesn't do any advice or directional therapy, is just identifying incongruences. So when you are reflecting back to a client what you're hearing them say, often they'll, for the first time, actually see the incongruence of what they're talking about. And so one of the things that I would always do with adolescents that didn't want to do schoolwork for a certain teacher because they would hate that teacher or whatever, is I would always say something like, so you really, really don't like this teacher, so you're just going to refuse absolutely to do any work from her because she's such a bully and she targets you, and this will result in you having her again next year. Just kind of showing them that incongruence of the decision that they're making. So your goal is to increase and allow a person to see how much incongruence is there from what they're saying they want and how they are acting, how it's not matching up. True, genuine empathy is a major component of existential, humanistic, person-centered therapy. Unconditional positive regard. You don't judge them. They're there. They're on their own walk, and you're just there with them. One of the things that's really important to always remember is that the client's story, the way that they tell the story, the way they see the story, the way they see everything unfolding, that is their reality of the events. So you're there to help them conceptualize and then reconceptualize and re-author their own story. Feminist theory, I think, a bad rap a lot of times because the title, I think, throws people off. But the basis of feminist theory is that it identifies inequality. The feminist theory doesn't actually believe in the DSM, but they want to advocate, empower clients for societal change. They have a belief system that the reason that we have symptoms is because of the way that we are judged, viewed, or reacted to or expected in society. So it's our reactions to the cultural impact. So an example of that would be, let's say that you had two couples. Both couples were, we're going to say male and female couple, two couples, one way down in the south, one way up north. The only differences between what's going on with these two couples is where they are located. So we have one down south, let's say, deep in Kentucky, and then we have one couple up in New York, for example. They end up getting married, having a baby. They were in college, and so they decide that it's not feasible for them both to remain in college because somebody has to get a job because they're having a baby. So they talked with their parents, and the family, all the family completely knew what they agreed upon, that dad was going to go get a job, mom was going to stay home with baby and finish school because she was a little bit closer in finishing her degree. And then once mom finished her degree, she would go get a job, and then dad could return to school and be the stay-at-home parent during that part of his time. So, same situation, both couples. So the question where the feminist theory comes in is, how different would it be for that dad once mom went to work and he went to the home and became the primary parent? What impact would he have depending on where he lived and what culture that was in? So that's where the feminist theory says the stress that he would feel has nothing to do with the actual fact that he's at home with his daughter or son. It has to do with the fact of where the culture and the expectations culturally that he resides in. And that's kind of the outlook of feminist theory. Family therapy, there's a lot of different types of family therapy out there. The biggest thing about family therapy that is really important to know is that it's very systemic. It looks at, there's not a person with a problem, it's a system with a problem. And so all your family therapies, whichever way they go, they're going to be, whether they're Bowen or Minuchin, they are focused on the fact that it is a system that has deficits, that doesn't work the way it needs to work. There are specific theories now that are based on spirituality and religion as a holistic approach. The one that I do know about, there's a couple that your book talks about. The one that I am familiar with is the wellness wheel. And the wellness wheel has, like, if you think of the old wagon wheels, have one like social, spiritual, health, financial, all these different life areas. And basically what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to look at each spoke and see how well you're doing. So the better you're doing, the longer your spoke. And so the ideal is if you're running on a flat tire, if some of your spokes are very short, then that's where your problems are and you need to be well-rounded. And then there's a couple mentions of therapy in conjunction with medication, pharmacology, intervention, and there's other types of treatment that go along with the medical model. The only thing I'm going to say about that is, as a therapist, you need to have knowledge of these different types of treatment that would go on outside of your office, but they are for another specialty. Your familiarity needs to be so that you are part of that treatment plan, part of that client's connection and team, but you need to be very careful on researching anything that you advise anyone on, because you don't want to advise something unless you're very familiar with the research on it. So you want to be very careful with that. And also in today's world with managed care, how you set up and request treatment and what that client is eligible for will also be dictated by what reimbursed from. So that's a quick overview of the basic theories. You'll get a lot more details in them in your theories and technique classes, family, different ones. And then we'll go on to chapter 5, licensure education.